So we're going to start today with effective observation, which is basically right mindfulness, the precursor to right collectedness or effective collectedness. And I'm going to start with Majjhima Nikaya number 10, the foundations of mindfulness. And here I go. This is translated by Bhikkhu Bodhi. Thus have I heard, on one occasion the Blessed One was living in the Kuru country, where there was a town of the Kurus named Kamasadhamma. There he addressed the bhikkhus thus. Bhikkhus, Venerable Sir, they replied, the Blessed One said this. Bhikkhus, this is the direct path for the purification of beings, for the surmounting of sorrow and lamentation, for the disappearance of pain and grief, for the attainment of the true way, for the realization of Nibbana, namely the four foundations of mindfulness. What are the four? Here, bhikkhus, a bhikkhu abides contemplating the body as a body, ardent, fully aware and mindful, having put away covetousness and grief for the world. He abides contemplating feelings as feelings, ardent, fully aware and mindful, having put away covetousness and grief for the world. He abides contemplating mind as mind, ardent, fully aware and mindful, having put away covetousness and grief for the world. He abides contemplating mind objects as mind objects, ardent, fully aware and mindful, having put away covetousness and grief for the world. And how, bhikkhus, does a bhikkhu abide contemplating the body as a body? Here a bhikkhu, gone to the forest or to the root of a tree or to an empty hut, sits down. Having folded his legs crosswise, set his body erect, and established mindfulness in front of him, ever mindful he breathes in, mindful he breathes out. Breathing in long, he understands, I breathe in long. Or breathing out long, he understands, I breathe out long. Breathing in short, he understands, I breathe in short. Or breathing out short, he understands, I breathe out short. He thus trains, I shall breathe in, experiencing the whole body. He trains thus, I shall breathe out, experiencing the whole body. He trains thus, I shall breathe in, tranquilizing the bodily formation. He trains thus, I shall breathe out, tranquilizing the bodily formation. Just as a skilled lathe operator or his apprentice, when making a long turn, understands, I make a long turn, or when making a short turn, understands, I make a short turn. So too, breathing in long, a bhikkhu understands, I breathe in long. He trains thus, I shall breathe out, tranquilizing the bodily formation. In this way, he abides contemplating the body as a body internally, or he abides contemplating the body as a body externally, or he abides contemplating the body as a body both internally and externally, or else he abides contemplating in the body its nature of arising, or he abides contemplating in the body its nature of vanishing, or he abides contemplating in the body its nature of both arising and vanishing, or else mindfulness that there is a body is simply established in him to the extent necessary for bare knowledge and mindfulness. And he abides independent, not clinging to anything in the world. That is how a bhikkhu abides contemplating the body as a body. Again, bhikkhus, when walking, a bhikkhu understands, I am walking. When standing, he understands, I am standing. When sitting, he understands, I am sitting. When lying down, he understands, I am lying down. or he understands accordingly however his body is disposed. In this way, he abides contemplating the body as a body internally, externally, and both internally and externally. And he abides independent, not clinging to anything in the world. That too is how a bhikkhu abides contemplating the body as a body. Again, bhikkhus, a bhikkhu is one who acts in full awareness when going forward and returning, who acts in full awareness when looking ahead and looking away, who acts in full awareness when flexing and extending his limbs, who acts in full awareness when wearing his robes and carrying his outer robe and bowl, who acts in full awareness when eating, drinking, consuming food and tasting, who acts in full awareness when defecating and urinating, who acts in full awareness when walking, standing, sitting, falling asleep, waking up, talking, and keeping silent. In this way, he abides contemplating the body as a body, internally, externally, and both internally and externally. And he abides independent, not clinging to anything in the world. That too is how a bhikkhu abides contemplating the body as a body. Again, bhikkhus, a bhikkhu reviews the same body made up from the soles of the feet and down from the top of the hair, bounded by skin, and full of many kinds of impurity. Thus, in this body there are head hairs, body hairs, nails, teeth, skin, flesh, sinews, bones, bone marrow, kidneys, heart, liver, diaphragm, spleen, lungs, intestines, mesentery, contents of the stomach, feces, bile, phlegm, pus, blood, sweat, fat, tears, grease, spittle, snot, oil of the joints, and urine. Just as though there were a bag with an opening at both ends full of many sorts of grain, such as hill rice, red rice, beans, peas, millet, and white rice, and a man with good eyes were to open it and review it thus: this is hill rice, this is red rice, these are beans, these are peas, this is millet, this is white rice. So too a bhikkhu reviews this same body as full of many kinds of impurity. Thus, in this body there are such and such. In this way, he abides contemplating the body as a body internally, externally, and both internally and externally. And he abides independent, not clinging to anything in the world. That too is how a bhikkhu abides, contemplating the body as a body. Again, bhikkhus, a bhikkhu reviews this same body, however it is placed, however disposed, by way of elements thus. In this body there are the earth element, the water element, the fire element, and the air element. Just as though a skilled butcher or his apprentice had killed a cow and was seated at the crossroads with it cut up into pieces, so too a bhikkhu reviews the same body by way of elements thus. In this body there are the earth element, the water element, the fire element, and the air element. In this way he abides contemplating the body as a body, internally, externally, and both internally and externally. And he abides independent, not clinging to anything in the world. That too is how a bhikkhu abides contemplating the body as a body. Again, bhikkhus, as though he were to see a corpse thrown aside in a charnel ground 1, 2, or 3 days, dead, bloated, livid, and oozing matter, a bhikkhu compares the same body with it thus. This body too is of the same nature. It will be like that, and it is not exempt from that fate. In this way, he abides contemplating the body as a body, internally, externally, and both internally and externally. And he abides independent, not clinging to anything in the world. That too is how a bhikkhu abides, contemplating the body as a body. Again, as though he were to see a corpse thrown aside in a charnel ground, being devoured by crows, hawks, vultures, dogs, jackals, or various kinds of worms, a bhikkhu compares this same body with it thus. This body too is of the same nature. It will be like that. It is not exempt from that fate. That too is how a bhikkhu abides, contemplating the body as a body. Again, as though he were to see a corpse thrown aside in a charnel ground, a skeleton with flesh and blood, held together with sinews, a fleshless skeleton smeared with blood, held together with sinews, a skeleton without flesh and blood, held together with sinews, disconnected bones scattered in all directions, here a hand bone, there a foot bone, here a shin bone, there a thigh bone, here a hip bone, there a backbone, here a rib bone, there a breastbone, here an arm bone, there a shoulder bone, here a neck bone, there a jawbone, here a tooth, there the skull. A bhikkhu compares this same body with it thus. This body too is of the same nature. It will be like that. It is not exempt from that fate. That too is how a bhikkhu abides, contemplating the body as a body. Again, as though he were to see a corpse thrown aside in the charnel ground, bones bleached white, the color of shells, bones heaped up, bones more than a year old, rotted and crumbled to dust. A bhikkhu compares this same body with it thus. This body too is of the same nature. It will be like that. It is not exempt from that fate. In this way, he abides, contemplating the body as a body internally, or he abides contemplating the body as a body externally, or he abides contemplating the body as a body both internally and externally, or else he abides contemplating in the body its nature of arising, or he abides contemplating in the body its nature of vanishing, or he abides contemplating in the body its nature of both arising and vanishing. Or else mindfulness that there is a body is simply established in him to the extent necessary for bare knowledge and mindfulness, and he abides independent, not clinging to anything in the world. That too is how a bhikkhu abides, contemplating the body as a body. And how, bhikkhus, does a bhikkhu abide contemplating feelings as feelings? Here, when feeling a pleasant feeling, a bhikkhu understands, I feel a pleasant feeling. When feeling a painful feeling, he understands, I feel a painful feeling. When feeling a neither painful nor pleasant feeling, he understands, I feel a neither painful nor pleasant feeling. When feeling a worldly pleasant feeling, he understands, I feel a worldly pleasant feeling. When feeling an unworldly pleasant feeling, he understands, I feel an unworldly pleasant feeling. When feeling a worldly painful feeling, he understands, I feel a worldly painful feeling. When feeling an unworldly painful feeling, he understands, I feel an unworldly painful feeling. When feeling a worldly neither painful nor pleasant feeling, he understands, I feel a worldly neither painful nor pleasant feeling. When feeling an unworldly neither painful nor pleasant feeling, he understands, I feel an unworldly neither painful nor pleasant feeling. In this way, he abides contemplating feelings as feelings internally, or he abides contemplating feelings as feelings externally, or he abides contemplating feelings as feelings both internally and externally, or else he abides contemplating in feelings their nature of arising, or he abides contemplating in feelings their nature of vanishing, or he abides contemplating in feelings their nature of both arising and vanishing, or else mindfulness that there is feeling is simply established in him to the extent necessary for bare knowledge and mindfulness. And he abides independent, not clinging to anything in the world. That is how a bhikkhu abides contemplating feelings as feelings. And how bhikkhus does a bhikkhu abide contemplating mind as mind? Here a bhikkhu understands mind affected by lust as mind affected by lust, and mind unaffected by lust as mind unaffected by lust. He understands mind affected by hate as mind affected by hate, and mind unaffected by hate as mind unaffected by hate. He understands mind unaffected by delusion as mind affected by delusion, and he understands mind unaffected by delusion as mind unaffected by delusion. He understands contracted mind as contracted mind, and distracted mind as a distracted mind. He understands exalted mind as exalted mind, and unexalted mind as unexalted mind. He understands surpassed mind as surpassed mind, and unsurpassed mind as unsurpassed mind. He understands concentrated mind as concentrated mind, and unconcentrated mind as unconcentrated mind. He understands liberated mind as liberated mind, and unliberated mind as unliberated mind. In this way, he abides contemplating mind as mind internally, or he abides contemplating mind as mind externally, or he abides contemplating mind as mind both internally and externally, or else he abides contemplating in mind its nature of arising, or he abides contemplating in mind its nature of vanishing, or he abides contemplating mind its nature of both arising and vanishing, or else mindfulness that there is mind is simply established in him to the extent necessary for bare knowledge and mindfulness. And he abides independent, not clinging to anything in the world. That is how a bhikkhu abides, contemplating mind as mind. And how bhikkhus does a bhikkhu abide contemplating mind objects as mind objects? Here a bhikkhu abides contemplating mind objects as mind objects in terms of the five hindrances. And how does a bhikkhu abide contemplating mind objects as mind objects in terms of the five hindrances? Here, there being sensual desire in him, a bhikkhu understands, there is sensual desire in me. Or there being no sensual desire in him, he understands, there is no sensual desire in me. And he also understands how there comes to be the arising of unarisen sensual desire, or how there comes to be the abandoning of arisen sensual desire, and how there comes to be the future non-arising of abandoned sensual desire. There being ill will in him, there being sloth and torpor in him, there being restlessness and remorse in him, there being doubt in him, a bhikkhu understands these hindrances are in me. Or there being no hindrances in him, he understands there are no hindrances in me. And he understands how there comes to be the arising of these hindrances, and how there comes to be the abandoning of these five hindrances, and how there comes to be the future non-arising of abandoned hindrances. In this way, he abides contemplating mind objects as mind objects internally, or he abides contemplating mind objects as mind objects externally, or he abides contemplating mind objects as mind objects both internally and externally, or else he abides contemplating in mind objects their nature of arising, or he abides contemplating in mind objects their nature of vanishing, or he abides contemplating in mind objects their nature of both arising and vanishing, or else mindfulness that there are mind objects is simply established in him to the extent necessary for bare knowledge and mindfulness, and he abides independent, not clinging to anything in the world. That is how a bhikkhu abides contemplating mind objects as mind objects in terms of the five hindrances. Again, bhikkhus, a bhikkhu abides contemplating mind objects as mind objects in terms of the five aggregates affected by clinging. And how does a bhikkhu abide contemplating mind objects as mind objects in terms of the five aggregates affected by clinging? Here a bhikkhu understands such is material form, such its origin, such its disappearance, such is feeling, such its origin, such its disappearance, such is perception, such its origin, such its disappearance, such are the formations, such their origin, such their disappearance, such is consciousness, such its origin, such its disappearance. In this way, he abides contemplating mind objects as mind objects internally, externally, and both internally and externally. And he abides independent, not clinging to anything in the world. That is how a bhikkhu abides contemplating mind objects as mind objects in terms of the five aggregates affected by clinging. Again, bhikkhus, a bhikkhu abides contemplating mind objects as mind objects in terms of the six internal and external bases. And how does a bhikkhu abide contemplating mind objects as mind objects in terms of the six internal and external bases? Here, a bhikkhu understands the I, he understands forms, and he understands the fetter that arises dependent on both. And he also understands how there comes to be the arising of the unarisen fetter, and how there comes to be the abandoning of the arisen fetter, and how there comes to be the future non-arising of the abandoned fetter. He understands the ear, he understands sounds, he understands the nose, he understands odors, he understands the tongue, he understands flavors, he understands the body, he understands tangibles, he understands the mind, he understands mind objects, and he understands the fetter that arises dependent on both the internal and external sense bases. And he also understands how there comes to be the arising of the unarisen fetter, and how there comes to be the abandoning of the arisen fetter, and how there comes to be the future non-arising of the abandoned fetter. In this way, he abides contemplating mind objects as mind objects internally, externally, and both internally and externally. And he abides independent, not clinging to anything in the world. That is how a bhikkhu abides contemplating mind objects as mind objects in terms of the six internal and external bases. Again, bhikkhus, a bhikkhu abides contemplating mind objects as mind objects in terms of the seven enlightenment factors. And how does a bhikkhu abide contemplating mind objects as mind objects in terms of the seven enlightenment factors? Here, there being the mindfulness factor, mindfulness enlightenment factor in him, a bhikkhu understands there is the mindfulness enlightenment factor in me. Or there being no mindfulness enlightenment factor in him, he understands there is no mindfulness enlightenment factor in me. And he also understands how there comes to be the arising of the unarisen mindfulness enlightenment factor, and how the arisen mindfulness enlightenment factor comes to be, comes to fulfillment by development. There being the investigation of states enlightenment factor in him, there being the energy enlightenment factor in him, there being the rapture enlightenment factor in him, there being the tranquility enlightenment factor in him, there being the collectedness enlightenment factor in him, there being the equanimity enlightenment factor in him. A bhikkhu understands there are these enlightenment factors in me, or there being no enlightenment factors in him, he understands there are no enlightenment factors in me. And he also understands how there comes to be the arising of the unarisen enlightenment factors, and how the arisen enlightenment factors come to fulfillment by development. In this way, he abides contemplating mind object as mind object, internally, externally, and both internally and externally. And he abides independent, not clinging to anything in the world. That is how a bhikkhu abides contemplating mind objects as mind objects in terms of the 7 enlightenment factors. Again, bhikkhus, a bhikkhu abides contemplating mind objects as mind objects in terms of the 4 noble truths. And how does a bhikkhu abide contemplating mind objects as mind objects in terms of the 4 noble truths? Here, a bhikkhu understands as it actually is. This is suffering. He understands as it actually is. This is the origin of suffering. He understands as it actually is. This is the cessation of suffering. He understands as it actually is. This is the way leading to the cessation of suffering. In this way, he abides contemplating mind objects as mind objects internally, or he abides contemplating mind objects as mind objects externally, or he abides contemplating mind objects as mind objects both internally and externally, or else he abides contemplating in mind objects their nature of arising, or he abides contemplating in mind objects their nature of vanishing, or he abides contemplating in mind objects their nature of both arising and vanishing, or else mindfulness that there are mind objects is simply established in him to the extent necessary for bare knowledge and mindfulness, and he abides independent, not clinging to anything in the world. This is how a bhikkhu abides contemplating mind objects as mind objects in terms of the 4 noble truths. Bhikkhus, if anyone should develop these 4 foundations of mindfulness in such a way for 7 years, one of 2 fruits could be expected for him. Either final knowledge here and now, or if there is a trace of clinging left, non-return. Let alone 7 years, bhikkhus. If anyone should develop these 4 foundations of mindfulness in such a way for 6 years, for 5 years, for 4 years, for 3 years, for 2 years, for 1 year, one of 2 fruits could be expected for him. Either final knowledge here and now, or if there is a trace of clinging left, non-return. Let alone 1 year, bhikkhus. If anyone should develop these 4 foundations of mindfulness in such a way for 7 months, for 6 months, for 5 months, for 4 months, for 3 months, for 2 months, for 1 month, for half a month, one of 2 fruits could be expected for him. Either final knowledge here and now, or if there is a trace of clinging left, non-return. Let alone half a month, bhikkhus. If anyone should develop these 4 foundations of mindfulness in such a way for 7 days, one of two fruits could be expected for him. Either final knowledge here and now, or if there is a trace of clinging left, non-return. So it was with reference to this that it was said, Bhikkhus, this is the direct path for the purification of beings, for the surmounting of sorrow and lamentation, for the disappearance of pain and grief, for the attainment of the true way, for the realization of Nibbana, namely the four foundations of mindfulness. That is what the Blessed One said. The bhikkhus were satisfied and delighted in the Blessed One's words. So this is a fundamental doctrine of the Buddha, if you will. It is essential to understand what the Buddha is saying here in this phenomenal discourse. He is categorizing the four foundations of mindfulness into these four: body, feelings, mind, and mind objects. And if anyone were to be mindful of any aspect of this conditioned existence, which is divided into these four, as the Buddha says, let alone all that time, within 1 week, one will attain arahatship. And if there is any clinging, non-return. So the Buddha here breaks down these into further exercises, if you will, in order to establish what is right mindfulness or effective observation. There's a reason why it's called effective observation. One is observing the arising and passing away in every moment of these different categories of conditioned existence. We'll take the body, for example. There are different ways in which the Buddha talks about looking at the body in a way that is not clinging, void of any craving, and completely dispassionate. The body itself, in that sense, has no self. What we attach to it, or what one attaches to it, is the sense of self in every moment, with the idea that there is a permanent self within the body. If it were not so, beings who feel threatened by certain things that are said about one's body would not be the case. In other words, when someone might say something about this body of ours, we have to first understand that this body is merely a different component of causes and conditions. In other words, the body is made up of different organs. It's made up of different cells, and each cell creates its own function, has its own function, and creates its own waste product. So in all of that, we have to understand, if there is an independent, unchanging, permanent sense of self, how could we link it to any aspect of this body, which in itself is made up of all of these different components of causes and conditions. Where in the cell which arises and passes away can you find the self? Where in the byproducts of the body can you find the self? Where in the movement of the body can you find the self? Is it before the movement? Is it in the movement? Is it after the movement? Where in it can you find the self? It's all coming from a series of causes and conditions. This is important to understand. So the Buddha divides up the body into different categories, like the 4 great elements. If we were to modernize, let's say, the 4 great elements to today's understanding, we can see it from the scientific perspective of a solid state, a liquid state, a gaseous state, and a plasma state. And the body, in that regard, is made up of all these different kinds of state on the molecular level and the atomic level. The body is created from the consumption of food, from the consumption of air. It's built up from the consumption of water. And it is dependent upon these things for its survival, if you will. So to project onto it any sense of self will ultimately and invariably create suffering. Because once the body is built up, it can also break down. If it does not have sufficient food, if it does not have sufficient air, if it does not have sufficient water, the body will break down. And therefore, the Buddha also talks about the body as what it is, really. It's a corpse. It's just a walking corpse that is built up by all of these different components and factors. So to say that there is a soul also residing within the body, where within that body will you find the soul? Is it within the feelings and sensations that arise within the body? Is it within the thoughts that arise in the body? Is it within the mental phenomenon that arise in the body? It can't be, because they arise and pass away too. Let's take, for example, thought itself. Thought arises and passes away. If it were not so, you would be having the very same thought from birth until death. However, within 1 microsecond, you have a dozen thoughts. So in all of that, where is a permanent sense of self? This is what needs to be understood and contemplated to really penetrate, if you will, the understanding of the 3 characteristics of existence. Let's take, for example, now the feelings or sensations. That's the thing, if one takes personal feeling, that then creates craving. The taking personal of feeling is craving itself. So the Buddha, he explains it in such a way that he's talking about just plainly understanding what sort of feeling is arising without projecting onto it any sense of self. So for example, if one is feeling tired, or the body in essence is feeling tired, there is the understanding of reality as it is, which is that the body is tired. But to project onto it, to say that I am tired and therefore this is causing me tiredness, or I have made myself tired, or anything related to that, starts to create stories. And the creation of these stories further go down into clinging. And this clinging attaches some sense of self to that body. And then that creates a reactionary response, or a reactionary idea, or a reactionary concept, or reactionary speech, which means that once you crave, or in other words, once you take personal the sensations that arise, whether it's hunger, thirst, tiredness, any biological aspect or sensation of the body, or even emotional states that are more rooted within the mind, as soon as you take those personal, then you start to create ideas and situations and stories internally around those feelings, which then lead to clinging. And then that leads to building up and accumulating of tendencies. And these tendencies then create some form of an identity that is linked and rooted with these associations, with the sensations that are arising and passing away in the body. And when that happens, one's mindfulness is no longer there. When one's mindfulness is no longer there, then one reacts out of ignorance, out of delusion, out of conceit, out of craving. However, if one is, for example, tired again, and just understands that this body is tired, or if there is some kind of irritation arising in the mind, and just simply understands the reality that there is irritation in the mind, that is the beginning of mindfulness. That is the beginning of recognizing the bodily and mental states in oneself, so to speak. And when one recognizes, one can prevent the arising of craving by understanding that there is just this irritation, or there is just this tiredness, or on the flip side, there is just this happiness, or there is just this energy within the mind and the body. And therefore, it was not caused by a sense of self, but caused by external or internal factors. If one understands this, then one lets go of the personalization of that feeling and just allows that feeling or sensation to be there and let it pass away and observe its passing away. This recognition aspect is the beginning of the meditation practice, which is the 6 R's. It's also the beginning of the process of the 4 right efforts, or effective application. How? When you start to see that there is irritation arising in the meditation practice, for example, and that it's a hindrance that creates distractions and creates a distracted mind, and therefore you recognize that you are no longer on your vehicle of meditation, which might be metta or any of the other Brahma Viharas, you then understand that you are distracted, and therefore come back to your object by first releasing the attention away from that distraction. And then you relax any kind of irritation or any kind of personalizing of that distraction. For example, I was distracted, or why did this distraction happen, or any other variant thereof, meaning either taking it personal, saying that I was distracted, or having aversion towards it. In other words, saying, why did I get distracted, or I shouldn't have been distracted, and all kinds of ideas and stories that might come about from that. You have to release your attention from anything that arises from such distractions, and then relax that craving, which I just mentioned, in the form of those stories and ideas of taking it personal. Then once you are aware of this, you are then aware of your smile when you're using the 6R process, and you come to understand, now I am smiling or I am not smiling, for example. Then you come back to your bringing up of the wholesome object, which could be your metta or any of the other Brahma Viharas. And then finally you continue on. But what's important to understand is, first you need to have that base of mindfulness. First you need to understand, where is your mind within the meditation? If it is continually observing the Brahma Viharas, you are fine. If it's doing anything other than observing the Brahma Vihara, then you have to use the 6R process, or the 4 right efforts, or effective applications, and then come back to your object or your vehicle of meditation. When it comes to these 5 hindrances, you have to understand that they are present within you. Don't try to analyze why did they come about. Just understand that they came about, let them go, and then come back to your object of meditation. The theory of why these hindrances came about can be understood later on through talks and through understanding the suttas. But what's important to understand within the context of the meditation and within the context of mindfulness is to not cling to them, to abandon any form of clinging to them by feeding your attention with questions like, why did this happen? Or how did this arise? But rather to let them go and come back to your object of meditation. What is important to understand through the hindrance is to see that if they came about, it is something that you need to face in that moment and let go of. Now, just briefly, let's talk about the hindrances on the level related to the precepts. We understand that ill will, for example, arises when one cultivates a mindset that is rooted in ill will through intentionally harming an individual being or any beings with action, speech, or thought. Just cultivating such an intention will cultivate, therefore, the hindrance of ill will to arise. So that's why it's important to keep that precept of abstaining and refraining from harming any being in thought, speech, or action with intention. Then you have the hindrance of restlessness. This arises rooted in conceit, and this arises when one starts to cultivate this idea of taking what is not given. And that does not only mean physical possessions. That also means looking for attention where it is not due, looking for credit or taking credit in something where it is not due, looking for your needs to be fulfilled when they cannot be fulfilled in that moment, but letting that go. And then rather than letting it go, looking for it and therefore projecting onto it a sense of self, and thereby stealing, in that sense, others' emotional needs, and stealing, in that sense, others' peace of mind. So the only thing you are responsible for in terms of your own emotional needs is to cultivate it for yourself, to look for it outside of one's mind, and therefore steal that kind of peace of mind from others in order to satisfy the sense of self's idea of peace of mind is also going to cause restlessness. And that's rooted in conceit, which is to say, taking it personal, taking all of these things to be I, me, or mine. Then you have doubt, or skeptical doubt, or doubt in oneself, or doubt in the meditation, or doubt in, am I doing this right? Is this working? What's going on? This arises from cultivating an attitude of falsifying, meaning using false speech, and in essence, tricking others. And by doing so, you start to not trust others, and thereby you don't trust your own capacities or your own capabilities. And this translates into the meditation as doubt of whether you're doing something right or not right. Then you have sloth and torpor. Sloth and torpor arises from indulging intoxicants. And intoxicants just doesn't mean drugs and alcohol. Now, one could say if one takes stimulants, it creates restlessness. And it would create restlessness in that moment, but it translates on a long-term basis into a dull mind, and it dampens that mind's ability to be able to be mindful and to be able to be collected within the meditation. And so intoxicants and indulgences also translate into doing something more than is required or more than satisfying one's needs. So that's basically indulging in the media, in news, in the internet, in technology, in even something as little as tea or coffee. By doing this, you are actually creating disturbances within, from a neuroscientific perspective, the neurotransmitters within the mind, within the brain. You are creating an imbalance of dopamine and serotonin, which within the meditation, within right collectedness or effective collectedness, comes about in certain increases within the first and second jhana, which is to say that the dopamine and serotonin arise when there is joy and bliss and rapture that one feels within the first and second jhana. However, if you indulge in things outside of the mind's capacity to feel these kinds of pleasure within jhana, you start to destabilize one's ability, the mind's ability, to be able to come back to these jhanic states. And as you get deeper and higher into these states, you will then be able to balance them in such a way that you can basically enter into other states at will, so to speak, whether that's cessation or nibbana itself as an object, so to speak. Then you have sensual craving, and this arises from the hindrance of sexual misconduct. But this also further translates into sensual misconduct, which is to say that one takes personal, first and foremost, let's go to sensual craving. One takes personal the sensory experiences that arise in the mind and through the five physical senses. And when this happens, and if one takes it personal, one becomes clinging to it. One creates this unsatisfiable desire and is always looking for more and more of the ability to satisfy this never-ending craving for the senses or for sensory experiences. And this creates heedlessness. So sexual misconduct on that regard, or in that regard, is such that if one indulges in sexual activities that create for oneself harm and creates harm for the other individual and creates heedlessness in one's mind, they will then create pain for oneself and pain for the other individual. And thereby one acts in sexual misconduct and attaches a sense of self to the sexual pleasure to the point that it blinds the person's ability to be mindful of one's own feelings and emotions and the other individual's feelings and emotions, and thereby creates an attachment that further roots one into craving, ignorance, and conceit. And so these are the five hindrances and their inverse relation to the following or not following of the five main and basic precepts. Now, the Buddha also mentions the mental objects. Well, first, before that, the Buddha talks about the mind states. So you come back to the meditation and you understand the mind, for example, as I said, is irritated or is distracted. So again, with your mindfulness, you are recognizing that this is the state of the mind, and then thereby you relax, you first release your attention from such a state, relax the craving that might have arisen, and then come back to your object of meditation by first creating that wholesome state through the smile. Now, going back to the mental objects in relation to the 7 enlightenment factors. These enlightenment factors are essential in order to cultivate a mind that will lead one to Nibbana. These 7 enlightenment factors are played with, so to speak, as one goes into higher and deeper states of jhana and understands where mind is in every given moment. In other words, for example, within the meditation, as you get higher into the jhanas, the mind becomes further and further clarified and purified. And you come to a point where the mind is so tranquil and so quiet that you are able to just keep that mind as your object or vehicle of meditation. In other words, mind is looking at mind itself without any thoughts or hindrances arising in those moments. While this is happening, what might occur is restlessness or sloth and torpor. So in order to balance mind and come back to that balanced state, the 7 enlightenment factors are looked at and generated in order to understand whether mind is still in a balanced state. So we'll take sloth and torpor. If there is sloth and torpor arising, first one uses one's mindfulness to say that yes, there is sloth and torpor in the mind. And so one is using mindfulness. Thereby, one generates minute amounts of joy or rapture, which is to take interest into the meditation practice. Sloth and torpor arises because mind has started to get quote-unquote bored. And this boredom arises because mind has become so used to the states of excitement and delight from the sensory experiences. And because those are no longer feeding mind, there is this sense of boredom, and that creates either sloth and torpor or restlessness. So then one creates or generates the enlightenment factor of energy after one brings up a little interest. And this is to create some form of effort to remain in a balanced state. And one also generates the investigative principle or the investigative enlightenment factor, which comes about when one understands that there's sloth and torpor, and then asks the mind or allows the mind to inform what is going on, and thereby allowing the mind to intuit that it requires the joy or the energy, and by doing so, one starts to balance back into a neutral state, so to speak, between sloth and torpor and restlessness. On the flip side, when it comes to restlessness arises primarily, as we just talked about, on the day-to-day level, when there is this personalizing of taking away not only physical possessions, so to speak, if they are not given, but also emotional and mental needs and social needs and things like that. But within the meditation itself, in the practice of the meditation itself, these restless thoughts or this restless energy arises because one is trying too hard. So it's along with the mind having not had any sensory experiences for so long within the duration of the meditation that the boredom arises. And because one tries too hard by essentially focusing rather than observing the meditation object or vehicle, that these restlessness and restless thoughts arise. So the balancing factors or the balancing enlightenment factors for this are, again, mindfulness. Because it is with mindfulness one recognizes that there's restlessness. So in whatever situation that arises, there is always the starting point of this mindfulness or this observation or this recognition that mind is, for example, in a restless state. And so to balance this restless state, one brings about the factor of tranquility, the enlightenment factor of tranquility, which is to relax that state of mind, which is to relax that restlessness by pulling back the focus, so to speak. Because essentially what's happening is the mind is focusing too hard rather than being collected, which is the other factor. So if you pull back, if you relax the mind and just come back to just observing in a relaxed state, you are essentially bringing up the tranquility enlightenment factor. This is how you do it. And then the equanimity enlightenment factor is not being affected by that restless state, which means not taking it personal and saying, oh, I am restless, oh, I got into restlessness, and all of these ideas and stories around it. It's to say and accept the reality as it is, that, okay, there is restlessness, and so now I am going to back away, or the mind is going to back away. So the equanimity is being able to accept the situation as it is without being affected through craving, aversion, clinging, conceit, or delusion. And then finally, you have collectedness, which is to say that you unify the mindset around your object. You have understood now at this point that the mind was focusing too hard. So you pull back through tranquility. You allow the situation to be as it is through equanimity. You use the 6R process, and then you come back to a collected state by just simply observing the Brahma Vihara, or whatever your vehicle or object of meditation is. And so this is how the 7 enlightenment factors come into play, especially in the higher jhanas. And then you eventually, as you continue with your object, slant slope towards Nibbana, towards seclusion, and you have the awakening of enlightenment. So this is how the entire process works. And in all of that, whether it's the hindrances as mental objects or the enlightened factors as mental objects, one is not to cling to it, which is to say one is not to take personal any aspect of it. So, for example, if you see that you are restless and you start to bring up the enlightenment factor, don't come from it with the attitude that I need to bring up this enlightenment factor, or that I am going to bring up this enlightenment factor. There is just the simple intention that, for example, if restlessness has arisen, that there's the intention that there is going to be tranquility. So there's the intention of pulling back. You will feel it through the mind and through the practice that there is a pulling back of that focus and coming back to observation. There is then the intention of creating minute equanimity, which is to say the intention of just letting it be and not being involved in it. And then the intention of being collected, which is to say unifying your attention around the object rather than being one-pointed and focused on the object. So that also extends beyond the meditation to everyday life with one's body, so to speak, one's mind, so to speak, and the mental phenomena that arises, along with the phenomena that arises outside of this body, in the sense that whatever is arising in the form of visual experiences, auditory experiences, the experiences of the smell, of taste, of the touch on the skin, and even thoughts should be understood as having arisen from a series of causes and conditions. Because if you look at it closely, any aspect of these within the body, within sensations, within feelings and sensations, within the mind, and within phenomenon, both internal and external, to project any sense of self onto it is delusional, especially because you understand, if you look closely, that because that they arise and pass away, they are therefore impermanent. And because they are coming from a series of causes and conditions, there cannot be any independent self attached to any aspect of this conditioned existence. And therefore one lets go. And in letting go, one no longer clings and grasps. And by not clinging and grasping, one's mind is freed. First and foremost, it's a matter of really phrasing it in such a way. For example, if you are mentally, verbally saying that I am generating a wholesome state, instead, if you first take the I out of the equation, which is to say that you say that, or rather, you, for example, when you first start out the meditation, when you're beginning, you say, may I be happy, in order to push along that wholesome state. So there's already a sense of I in there. But once you have let go of that verbalizing, which is when you feel tense, when the mind feels tense, if it tries to verbalize, you start to let go of it, and then you bring up an image, or you bring up something else that starts to create and generate that wholesome state. But in doing that, let's say silently, so to speak, which is that you don't verbalize it anymore, you have to come from it with no longer attaching that memory as your memory. For example, if it's a happy memory, you say, or you understand that this memory came about as a series of causes and conditions. You have to detach that me, my, and I from it, and allow it to generate the wholesome state of mind, the wholesome quality of mind. And when you do have the wholesome quality of mind, look at it from a detached perspective, which is to say that you look at it as, now there is a wholesome state, which is again using that mindfulness, which is saying that instead of I am in a wholesome state, there is a wholesome state present within mind. So when you begin the meditation, you don't start with I am meditating or I am going to meditate. You close your eyes, you relax, and you use mindfulness in the regard of saying that the body is presently in this condition, the mind is presently in this condition, and then if it requires relaxing it, you relax the mind, and then it requires bringing up a wholesome state, bring it up in whatever way it works, whether it's a harmonious image or whether it's a wholesome memory, whatever works for that mind, do so, but do so with, for example, you bring up a harmonious image, something that creates a smile on the face. You come with it from the mindfulness that now this is creating a wholesome state, instead of saying or thinking or projecting that I am now feeling wholesome. So it's a matter of disconnecting the sense of doership, disconnecting the sense of self and any words of I, me, or mine, or thereof related to a sense of self. And just like a scientist, so to speak, be very objective in that regard and say, or think, or understand that there is present now a harmonious, wholesome state of mind, and allow that to be observing. And then in the observing itself, don't say that I am observing this, but that there is an observing going on. So that's within the context of the meditation. Outside of the meditation too, whenever a feeling arises, like I just mentioned earlier, where if there is tiredness in the body, you will notice that as soon as one projects with a sense of self, and what I mean by that is with the conceit, with the inherent conceit that I am tired. In other words, there's a difference between, say, one of a release mind who says I am tired, and essentially meaning the body is tired, but not projecting in that usage of the word I a sense of self, and understanding that the body is tired, does not suffer from that tiredness and just merely understands that there is tiredness. Whereas if you were to say I am tired with the conceit rooted in that sense of that word I, you will not only feel tired, but you will feel other things related to that tiredness, and then thus cause yourself suffering. So as a initial practice, so to speak, as a exercise, as a simple exercise, one can detach that word I from whatever is arising as a exercise, and then little by little start to understand, oh, this is just impersonal phenomenon happening, If I superimpose the I, there is where the suffering arises. But if it's just phenomenon arising because of a series of impersonal causes and conditions, that means it will also pass away. It's the taking of it personal in day-to-day life that one attaches permanency, one attaches a sense of eternalism to what is arising. And so the mind in that regard is more attending towards the arising and the aspect between the arising and passing away, which is to say the arising and then the plateau and then the cessation. So the mind in which continues to use the word I from the sense of a deep-rooted sense of conceit or sense of self will be focused on creating a permanent sense in that plateau. So in day-to-day life, when feeling arises or anything arises, make it an exercise of mindfulness to detach any sense of I to that phenomenon, whether it is happening to the body or to the mind or sensations, or whether it's external phenomenon. And by doing so, you start to understand that because this is all impersonal, that will translate in the meditation as, okay, the mind is this way right now. If there is a need to 6R, you 6R, come back or generate the wholesome quality of mind. And then on the deeper level of meditation, when there is the intention, for example, to bring up any or other aspects of the 7 enlightenment factors, intention is simply the thought of it carrying that intention. It's not saying that I require this particular enlightenment factor or my mind requires this enlightenment factor. It's just that there is a need for this enlightenment factor to arise. And just in the very seeing of that, the intention is in some sense pushed. And thereby there will be that balance because the mind is so purified at that point, so tranquil, that very minute forms of intention will affect it quite greatly. But that intention itself should not have that personalizing. Yeah. So let's use that phrase, understanding reality as it is, or taking reality as it is, or seeing reality as it is. In no way does that mean accepting or letting go in such a way as to lead to non-action, which can create further negative components in one's life. In other words, once you see reality as it is, rather than projecting a sense of self, rather than projecting craving onto it, which is to say that right now this reality, I don't like it, or right now I really like this reality and I want more of it, or just the idea that this reality is affecting me. If you take it personal, that's what needs to be rooted out. That's what needs to be understood. And the action that is then therefore taken comes from clarity that is void of the craving. So the craving, let's understand first, is the personalizing through desire or through attachment, through wanting more of it, or through ill will or aversion or not wanting more of it, and finally taking it to be personal in the sense that it is affecting some kind of sense of permanent self. So that's craving. And when that arises, it automatically clouds the mind. And thereby it then creates that reactions or that chain reaction of clinging and becoming and so on and so forth, and then leading to suffering. But accepting reality as it is means to see reality as it is by first and foremost letting go any kind of attachment or aversion that might have already arisen in that situation first, by using the 6R process and thereby relaxing the tension from that craving. From that comes that clarity of mind, comes that clear mind. As was discussed earlier, when you relax that tension, which is the craving in the mind and body, there is an open space within the mind. There is a sense of spaciousness within the mind that's like a clear blue sky, void of any thoughts or very small wisps of thoughts. In that mind, then, one acts. From that mind, one acts. So first and foremost, accepting reality is first understanding what the reality is in one's own mind. Is there a personalizing of what is going on right now? If there is, let go of that, relax the craving, and then from that mind, there will be clarity. And from that clarity, there will be an insight into how one should act. And of course, one will act according to the Brahmaviharas and act rooted within the Eightfold Path, which is to say one will exercise right speech if required, where one speaks or does not speak according to the situation. One acts and then therefore behaves according to the situation that will create a wholesome state for everyone involved. So it starts first and foremost when you accept reality, which is to say understanding what the reality of the situation is in one's mind. Once you see that there is personalizing going on, you let go of that personalizing. And then when you find that clear mind, you will have the insight of how to act according to the situation. So, yes, there's a lot of information. For example, within the context of the body, there are so many different types of exercises. There is the anapanasati, which is in this regard, understanding I breathe long, and therefore I breathe long. If I'm breathing short, I know I'm breathing short, and so on and so forth. And then there's the tranquilizing aspect of breathing in and breathing out. Then there's also looking at the different components of the body in relation to the four great elements, or the different aspects within the body, which is the different organs and different processes that function within the body, and then finally seeing the body as a corpse. All of these different practices are related or rooted for someone of different kinds of mentalities or mindsets. So these are recommendations or recommended practices to root out certain ideas within the mind of what the body is. But at the end, in every aspect the Buddha talks about, he says it can also be this mindfulness that this is the body, or the mindfulness that this is the mind, or the mindfulness that this is the feeling, or this is the mind object, for the bare knowledge of what is arising and passing away. So in the arising and passing away, there is the bare knowledge, if it arises in that present situation, that there is present now this particular hindrance. Insofar as that, this is the practice and exercise of mindfulness. And that is the beginning of the step, which is the recognize aspect, the remembering aspect, and thereby the collectedness aspect, or the effective collectedness aspect, is the rooting out of the hindrance through the rest of the 6R process, or through the rest of the 4 right effort process. So it's important to understand where one is in the present moment as the beginning of the meditation, as the beginning of the practice. But that also translates into day-to-day life, which we just talked about, which is one is present that there is right now anger in the mind, for example, or one is aware now that there is present right now irritation, or there is present right now lethargy in the body, there is present right now hunger in the body, and so on and so forth. But by saying actually and understand that there is present in this body or in this mind, you have actually stepped back the sense of I from it, first and foremost. Let's look at it that. And thereby, what's important here, which is when the Buddha finishes the insight aspect of each category of body, feeling, mind, and mental object, he talks about the arising and passing away, and thereby looking at the arising and passing away, and to root out and abandon the clinging aspect of it. So while there are these recommended practices in relation to, let's say, the foulness aspect of the body or the anapanasati and so on and so forth, they are cultivated for certain mindsets to root out certain desires related to the body, which is taking the body as self. But even after that, or despite that, there is still an easier way, so to speak, by just understanding there is present this body and letting go of any notions around the body. There is present right now this particular mind or mindset or mental object or feeling, and taking any notions of sense of self away from those things. So it's about abandoning the clinging, as he says in his exposition or the summary of the exposition of each category. The abandoning of the delight and desire and lust that arises from these components that needs to be abandoned. So first, the mindfulness is to be aware what condition is the mind in related to any of these four aspects of conditioned existence, and then accordingly root out any personalizing, root out any craving, and root out any ignorance that might be arising from them. And so, taking into account the daily life, you then are in that moment aware that right now there is this emotional state or mental state present. And once you understand it, you then let go of any personalizing and craving of it, and then from there you act. And then within the meditation context, when you are aware that you are distracted, for example, or when you are aware that one of the enlightenment factors are weak in the mind presently, you are made aware of it. It's just a bare knowledge that this is so, and coming back to what is required for the meditation or what is required for the situation in your daily life. So mindfulness in that regard is, once again, as we talked about earlier, is remembering where you are in relation to the present situation. And that is categorized in the present conditions of body, of feeling, of mind, and of our mental objects.
May suffering ones be suffering free, and the fear-struck fearless be. May the grieving shed all grief, and may all beings find relief. May all beings share this merit that we have thus acquired for the acquisitions of all kinds of happiness. May being inhabiting space and earth, Devas and Nagas of mighty power, share this merit of ours. May they long protect the Buddha's dispensation. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.